Hi everyone, I'm David Tepfer of The Screaming Brain, and in this weekly video series, I'm going to be talking to you about the ins and outs of board game design in all of its forms. So that's including card games, miniature games, and digital versions of board games. And in this, which is going to kind of be our pilot video, I'm going to be talking about rulebooks. Now, rulebooks have, and probably always will be, the biggest barrier to enter the board gaming hobby. They're this massive stop sign at the beginning of every fun experience you will have with a board game. And everything about them is counterintuitive with how we should be learning games and teaching them to our players. Unlike video games, we aren't able to program into our games responses to player actions. We lack that classic staple of discovery-based learning, stimulus and response. There's no limit to player input or the way players can interact with our games, but there's almost nothing board games can do to provide a response. So this is kind of the question I want to pose in this first video. What if there was a way for us to program in responses to our games to players' interaction? So a handful of designers in the industry have been starting to look at this question as well. How do we teach our games with as little rules as possible? How do we minimize a player's drop in excitement from when they first open the box to reading the first page of text in our rulebook? And what some of these designers have come up with is a legacy system. Now I'm using quotes here because there are a ton of variations of this method with different names. But what I want to look at most is the legacy and fabled game systems. Most famously, Matt Leacock, the designer of Forbidden Island, Forbidden Desert, and Pandemic, applied this concept to his award-winning game Pandemic, creating Pandemic Legacy. Before being a game designer, Matt was a UI UX designer and tried to use the legacy system of the game changes each time you play it to drip-feed rules to players. So starting with the basic Pandemic rules, players are slowly introduced to new mechanics and changes to the base rules depending on how well they perform with each playthrough. For people who already knew the basic rules for Pandemic, this means that they could jump right into the start and only have to read 1 or 2 new rules with each play, basically removing the low points of having to read a ton of rules. However, if you haven't played Pandemic before, this would be a pretty tough game to get into. Having to learn the basic rules for a new game as well as the legacy system, I think in some ways, Matt's thinking worked though, especially since Pandemic was such a massive success. Most people who are deep into the hobby already knew Pandemic really well, but we can't create new games with this concept. And that's where the Fabled and Fast Forward systems come in. The Fabled system is part of a series of games published by Strongholds Games by designer Friedemann Friese. What Fabled does is take a simple, sometimes well-known mechanic like worker placement, teach it, and then expand upon it over the course of many games by introducing rules and mechanics. In the case with their game Fabled Fruits, it adds new locations to place your worker with more complex actions at a rate about 1 or 2 new locations per game. The only problem is that these games need to be inherently simple, otherwise the initial setup would be too complex to explain in a few lines of text. And further rules could muddle the system, making it confusing to learn as you play. Both of these systems look at ways to speed players towards getting in and playing their game, while slowly building on a simple or already learned base. Then slowly add more as time and plays go on until you've learned a full game. But can we do this better? Fast Forward suffers from not being able to teach complex games, and Legacy tends to leave me feeling like I had to play 12 times before I played a finished game. I feel like there's so much we can do with board games to encourage discovery-based learning for players, to make learning how to play the game part of playing, and there are themes to support this. What first comes to mind is the classic dungeon crawler. It is literally a theme based on play discovery. So what if we match the game to the theme? Now we are talking about a truly immersive experience, learning how to tackle encounters as we discover them, being true dungeon delvers. Well, that's going to be all for this week's episode. I really hope that you found this concept as intriguing as I did. As designers and potential designers, we all have a responsibility to our players and the hobby in general to try and create games with the greatest experience possible. You can find out more about board game design and the board gaming hobby by following us on Facebook at The Screaming Brain Games, or you can follow our blog at www.thescreamingbrain.com. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact us at info@thescreamingbrain.com. Thanks so much and have a good night.